So if states gave up the power to make laws over the state lands, then why does the Constitution exclusively state that in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, that the states had to give up all lawmaking authority over the lands purchased by the federal government, and that the federal government could be the lawmaking authority in that state? The reason why is because the states never gave up lawmaking authority of any kind over state lands other than the land ceded to the federal government for federal purposes. And it's in those places, there are two places, the seat of government and the lands purchased for defense, where the federal government has authority. The people on those lands are public persons. The people off the federal lands are private persons. Now, the word citizen means member. So you can be a member of the public or you can be a member of the private. And it really shouldn't matter to the federal government whether you're an American citizen, a state citizen, or any other kind of citizen, because it has no authority over anyone not on federal lands. So I call myself a private American civilian. Eisenhower, in his farewell speech, called himself a private citizen. So if citizen means member, then he's simply saying he's a member of the private class of people. The private class of people do not pay federal taxes because they are not public personnel. They are not federal personnel, and they are not state personnel, meaning that they don't work for the state. Trump's attorney, when Trump left office, said that Trump was leaving public office to become a private citizen. So he didn't actually have to become a private citizen. When he left public office, he was naturally a private person. When Washington was retiring, George Washington, and he wrote a letter to a friend of his, he said that he was leaving the private life he said he was leaving the public life to become a private citizen, living a quiet life. Okay? So there are federal citizens, and they are called several different things. In the Constitution, they're called citizens of the United States because the United States are the federal lands, and the federal lands are the seat of government and the lands purchased for defense. They're called citizens of the United States in the Constitution, but there are executive orders that call them also United States citizens, United States persons, United States entities, but they're also called taxpayers because people on federal lands pay federal taxes. The people off federal lands who are private, which is everyone off federal lands, are not required to pay taxes, federal taxes. The reason for Title 26 was because there needed to be a check on the people working for the federal government to make sure that they're not abusing power, to make sure that they're not stealing money, to make sure that they're not enhancing their private wealth through public gain, through the use of their public office. So they had all these things in place to make sure that public people, federal citizens, weren't stealing from the government. or using the government to enlarge their private businesses or get ahead on investing in stocks. There's nothing in the Constitution that says the federal government is supposed to be in charge of the stock market. There's nothing in the Constitution that says it's a requirement for businesses to register with the federal government. There's only the requirement that if the federal government needs contractors to do work on the federal lands to help build the forts and the necessary buildings, that they would go on the post to build those buildings, and that the federal government had a right to make those contracts for that work to be done. So the ideas in the Constitution have been expanded. The Constitution was supposed to be the foundation of law. That's LAW. The Constitution is the LAW, which means it's the foundation for all the laws that the United States passes, and all the treaties. All the laws and the treaties of the federal government are supposed to receive its authority, its foundation, from the federal Constitution. Many people believe that the Constitution gives the federal government the right to make laws off federal lands, such as federal taxes, control of commerce, impost, excise, copyrights, and patents. But all those things were actually supposed to be for the people on the federal lands. The founders were against a national bank, yet we have a national bank. And they use the contract clause in the Constitution to create this national bank. But they actually couldn't constitutionally do it because they couldn't purchase lands for defense and put a bank on it. So what they did was they acquired lands instead of purchasing for defense. They acquired lands in some other way off federal lands, meaning it was land owned by the states, and they purchased it in the same way anyone would purchase lands, not for federal purposes. So when the federal government purchases lands for federal purposes, which is for defense only, that was the only thing that they had constitutional authority to do, was purchase lands for defense. And then they had a list of things they could do on those lands, such as tax, impost, excise, commerce, control what comes on the post, control what goes off the post, tax things that come on the post, tax the things that go off the post. And then the states agreed that in between all the federal posts, that they would not restrict commerce, that they would not restrict movement of traffic. So the banks are off federal lands, on state lands, where the federal government acquired those lands in the same way any private citizen would acquire the lands, which means that the federal banks have no authority or power. Furthermore, the Constitution only allows power to be, or authority to be delegated, which it was first delegated in the Constitution. So when the states agreed to the Constitution, meaning they ratified it, they agreed that they would give some lands to the federal government to do federal things. That was the ratification. All they did was agree to give some lands to them. They didn't agree to be to have their sovereignty taken away from them. They never agreed to have banks on state lands, and it's not in the Constitution. So that power was never delegated by the states to the federal government to create a national bank. And because that power was never delegated, the federal government can't assume it and then delegate it to someone else, which is what they've done. They've delegated it to corporations, which are called instrumentalities, and they use the president's power as executive officer of the United States of America, which is, again, a stretch in the meaning of the Constitution, because there's really no authority in the Constitution for the president to acquire lands, not for defense, and then establish an instrumentality which can put a national bank and then give it authority over people that are not on federal lands, private people. So how they got around that was to advertise, basically, or propagandize the Social Security Act. And what they did was they made people think that it was for everyone by saying stuff like, well, old women should be allowed to be independent and take care of themselves, and that's what the Social Security Act does. But the Social Security Act is a power not actually delegated to the federal government through the Constitution. So the Social Security Act issues Social Security numbers to private citizens, which are everyone not on federal lands and not doing work for the federal government, to bring them in under federal power, because now you receive a benefit from the federal government. Receiving a benefit from the federal government allows them some power or authority, which is called jurisdiction, over you. They also did this basically the same with addresses and using a zip code. So the federal government has established addresses and zip code through the federal post office, which places people and their homes and their properties in commerce. What this does is puts you again under the federal authority. So it brings your property in under Title 26, which is the Internal Revenue Code for the Internal Revenue Service, and it makes your property lienable by the IRS because now it's in commerce under the federal laws, which Title 26 is not actually a federal law because it was never given a positive law citation. Without a positive law citation, it's not a command, because positive laws are commands. So not being a command, it's a contract. And as a contract, in order for the federal government to contract with you, a private citizen, it has to assume that you are wanting to help the federal government by contracting with it for military purposes to prop up the military industrial complex. So in order to do that, it has to make you under its power. Private citizens, it has to make you public. So it issues you a federal address, which places you in federal commerce under federal control under the Commerce Clause. And then it brings you in also through your Social Security number, because you have to put all these things on your tax forms. And then it you claim to be a United States citizen or citizen of the United States or federal person or federal citizen or United States person, United States entity, which makes you a taxpayer. That's why they say taxes are voluntary, but everyone has to pay. Well, everyone doesn't have to pay until after you sign the contract. After you sign the contract, you have to pay. So if you don't pay and you sign the contract, they put you in prison because you agreed to pay. And contracts are the law. So the contract, according to contract laws, according to the basic ideas of contract law, if you make a contract and you don't come through on your end of it, the things in the contract that you agreed to will happen to you. So if you make a mistake on your tax return, they say, that they can charge you. And if you don't pay the amount that they want you to pay or you agreed to pay, they charge you, and they charge you interest. If you say that you're going to pay and then you don't pay and then you can't pay, they can take your property, they can confiscate your pay, your income through your employer, they can put you in jail, all these different things, because all those things are in the titles, even though the titles aren't passed into positive law. So they're not requirements. They're offers to contract. They have no positive law citation. And there's many of these titles that don't have positive law citations, such as banks and banking. Now, banks and banking is what the Federal Reserve uses for its authority, which means it's a contract. So it contracts with people, and people agree to the contracts, and contracts can be express or implied. So in reality, the Federal Reserve Bank has no authority. It's not on federal lands. They're on state lands ran by the federal government. They're not federal entities. They're instrumentalities, which are private corporations regulated by the federal government. And they're regulated through the titles not passed into positive law, meaning they're not laws, they're contracts. So they're contracts with the federal government. And when they pass along these forms to you, you agree to the forms, and so you agree to everything in the title that's not actually a law. Because like I said, that's how contract law works. So we're in a situation today where people are not understanding that they don't have to contract with the federal government, and that they need to change their status. And there's not a piece of paper you have to send anywhere to do this. You just have to stop claiming to be a citizen of the United States, or a federal person, or a federal citizen, or a United States citizen, or a United States person, or a United States entity, or a taxpayer. The federal forms, when not used for federal purposes, which most of them aren't, they're not compliant with the ideas of federalism, which is defined in Executive Order 13132, which you can find on the internet. And it's got definitions in there. And since they don't comply with the ideas of federalism, they're not commands. And even if they were commands, they're only commands to people who are on federal lands and claim to be federal personnel or federal citizens, members of the federal government. They're not for private citizens. So if you fill out the form and put private citizen on it, private address, instead of putting your federal address and you write private, or it asks for a social security number and you say none, or it asks for a legal name and you put none, then they have no contract with you, because they can't contract with private people. They have no authority to do that. I believe it's probably not in the laws, but it's also probably not in the charters. And it's likely written somewhere in an executive order, since it seems like the instrumentalities are all under the executive office. So you have two offices for president. You have the executive of the United States of America, and then you have commander-in-chief of the land and naval forces of the United States. So you have the president having two different offices. One for the United States, which is an instrumentality of the states or an agency of the states, and one for all the country as the executive officer. Now, the executive officer means that the president is second in command. And I believe that's only if there's an issue in the state where the president has to step in, and is only allowed to step in for certain purposes that are in the Constitution, like some sort of uprising or something. So if you look at the birth certificate for Texas, and I think also Ohio, it states on the application, not the birth certificate itself, but the application, that the application is is a legal document. The legal document places you into that legal system, the public system, the system you don't want to be in. Without that paper, you're just another private person. So there's actually no requirement for a private person to apply for a birth certificate for a legal entity. But if you go to the hospital to have a baby, the administration will push it on you and say you have to fill it out. So if I were going to have another child in the hospital, I would fill it out, because they offer to steal your baby from you if you don't, these days in some hospitals. Where it says mother's legal name, I would say none. Where it says child's legal name, I would say none given. Where it says address, I would say private. And if it asks for a citizenship status, I would say private. And I would leave it at that, and I wouldn't put anything else on there. And if they ask me to do it and that I have to claim to be a citizen of the United States, then we have a fight, and they have nothing to stand on, because the laws they're using aren't actually laws, because they weren't passed into positive law. Now, people get confused here between state and federal. Okay, so let's think about this for a minute. Like I said, the federal government, or the states, never gave the federal government power over the entire land area of the state. They only agreed to annex some lands to the federal government. And those lands had to be annexed through a selection process by the state. And when the state annexed those lands became federal property inside the state. So when you have, for example, Virginia, Virginia gave some little teeny tiny pieces of land to the federal government to build forts on. The lands inside Virginia that were given to the federal government became known as State of Virginia. So it erected a new state in Virginia called State of Virginia. So you had Virginia and you had State of Virginia. And after Virginia joined the Union, it annexed a little bit more lands on the western part of the state. And so in the congressional record, it said something like this: Virginia annexed or ceded to the United States, meaning the seat of government, an area to the western part of the state to become State of Virginia. And it did this with several other states, North Carolina and Tennessee, because this is from a very, very early congressional record, like 1798 or something. So State of Virginia are all the federal lands inside Virginia, and it's the same way with most of the states. So when the federal government asks you to form a contract with it and to allow your child to become part of that contract, creating a legal identity for your child using a federal address, it's placing it inside that federal state, inside your state. So, State of Texas is for the federal people. That's where you get the 14th Amendment that Lincoln passed, that a citizen of the federal government is also a citizen of the state, which by state, he meant the federal state created inside the sovereign state. Okay, because a state had to be sovereign in order to join the union. It couldn't be in the union and join the union, and it wouldn't need to be. It would need to be sovereign in order to pass some sovereignty off to the federal government. And when it did that, it only did it over the federal lands. So in Texas, the state government annexed some lands to the federal government, and all those federal lands became state of Texas, which is a little confusing because when Lincoln came into office, he used the military to take over the sovereign legislation of Texas, which was called Republic of Texas. He took it over and forced it under federal control, making the entire state of Texas. But he did it illegally because it was outside the foundation of law set by the Constitution. Law, L-A-W, not laws. The Constitution is law, L-A-W, which means it's the foundation for all the laws passed by the United States and all the treaties agreed to by the United States. So once Lincoln expanded the state, it was sort of a soft expansion. So it still requires private citizens to agree by contract. And that contract starts with the birth certificate, which is a legal document where you claim to have a federal address, you claim to have a legal name, and you claim to have a legal parent, and you're creating a legal name for your child, which is a application for a legal certificate with the federal government. And in Texas, the application states that it's a legal document for the state of Texas, the federal lands. Okay? So originally, the federal government could not draft people into the military. The state had to do that. The state could only draft its private citizens into the military, and they were called privates. Okay? When they went and they worked for the federal government as a militia, they were called privates. If they joined the federal government and became a federal citizen, they were given a rank. Okay? They were either commissioned or non-commissioned or enlisted, I guess. So when you sign the birth certificate, when you sign it, you're creating a legal document for the federal government inside the state, and you're putting yourself and your child into that system, and you're putting your address into that system, which means now they force your kid into a public school, which is a federal school. And in the federal laws, it's called a small business. The schools are called small businesses. Small businesses are then called small jurisdictions. That's how they sort of do this wordplay, because the federal government was given jurisdiction over the federal lands. So the schools come under federal jurisdiction, and then it's called a small jurisdiction. It's all bullshit, really, but this is how they do it. This is my understanding of how they're doing it. CPS works for state of Virginia, state of Tennessee. Now, in Ohio, a friend was telling me they don't have state of Ohio, they just have Ohio. Okay? And I pointed out that they may have dropped the state of, but you're still required, in order to get a Ohio driver's license, which places you under federal control, you're still required to use the legal document, the birth certificate, which has a federal address on it and has a maybe a social security number on it and has a legal name on it. You're required to have a social security card, which again places you under the federal jurisdiction of its instrumentalities. You have then a driver's license with a federal address on it and a legal name, and documentation for them that you're under federal control. So even if they just say Ohio, you still have to meet all the requirements of being a federal person or a federal citizen to get that Ohio driver's license. So it's not an actual Commonwealth of Ohio or Republic of Ohio driver's license, it's a federal driver's license. It's still federal, okay? So people ask me all the time, well, who do the police work for? And I say, well, who pays them? It all ends up coming from the Federal Reserve Bank, which is an instrumentality regulated by the federal government and it appears under the executive office. So this is their expansion of power. And all those things not delegated to the federal government that they are doing is outside the Constitution. Which means in some way you had to, and I had to, agree to it through a contract and claiming to be a federal citizen or a federal person. Okay, so when you think about the driver's license, the social security number, your federal address, placing you in commerce, signing papers, signing forms that are advertisements or solicitations by the federal government for you to contract with them, because these forms do not comply with the ideas of federalism, meaning they're not constitutional. They're contracts, which they are allowed to make contracts, but for federal purposes. So they take all these things and then they tax you. They send CPS to your house. They fine you. They stop you on the road and ticket you. Take your kids away, tell you have to see a licensed doctor to get medications. All these things go back to the birth certificate being a legal contract with the federal government to be under its power and control, and creating a legal identity and all these things that we've talked about. So if you start understanding this, you'll start understanding how to back out of it, how to get out of it. And just like the presidents, so many of them have said, when they retire from public office, from being a federal person, from being a federal citizen, a citizen of the United States, a United States citizen, a United States person, a United States entity, or a taxpayer, when they retire and leave public service, they go back to private life and become a private citizen. Citizen is member, means member. So you're a member of the private class of people, no longer regulated by the federal government. So if you want to get a birth certificate and become a legal entity so that you can do work for the federal government, with the federal government, or contract with it to pay federal taxes, then you can. You can, of course, always do that if you want to be a part of that. But what I'm saying is that you don't have to.